Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Edmund Gettier wrote a 3-page paper in 1963 that destroyed 2,000 years of philosophy, not by offering a new theory, not by constructing an elaborate argument, not by marshalling evidence or appealing to grand principles, but simply by describing two cases, two simple scenarios where someone has a justified true belief that clearly is not knowledge. And these cases were so straightforward, so devastating, so impossible to dismiss, that they shattered the definition of knowledge that had stood since Plato, the definition that said knowledge was justified true belief. And in the decades since philosophers have tried to repair the damage, have proposed dozens of modifications and additions and qualifications, have added fourth conditions and fifth conditions, have distinguished types of justification and types of truth and types of belief, and none of it has worked. None of it has produced a definition that captures all and only cases of knowledge, that avoids counterexamples, that does what definitions are supposed to do. And the question is whether this failure reveals something about knowledge itself, whether knowledge resists definition not because philosophers have not been clever enough, but because definition is the wrong tool, because knowledge is not the kind of thing that can be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, because the project of analysing knowledge was misconceived from the start. The cases themselves are almost too simple. In one, a person looks at a clock that has stopped but happens to look at the moment when the stop time matches the actual time. They form a justified true belief about what time it is. The belief is true. The justification seems perfectly adequate. They looked at a clock and clocks are generally reliable. But this is not knowledge. It is luck. It is coincidence. It is the kind of situation where we want to say the person got it right but did not know. And in the other case, a person believes their colleague owns a Ford because they have seen them driving a Ford for years. They infer from this that someone in the office owns a Ford. And it turns out someone in the office does own a Ford, but it is not the colleague. It is someone else entirely. And again, there is justified true belief, but no knowledge. The justification was good. The belief was true. But the connection between justification and truth went through the wrong path, depended on a falsehood succeeded by accident rather than by the proper relation between evidence and reality. These cases reveal something philosophers had not noticed before, that justification and truth can come apart in subtle ways, that a belief can be justified and true without the justification being what makes it true, without the truth being because of the justification. And this gap, this disconnect, this possibility of luck intervening between justification and truth is what makes justified true belief insufficient for knowledge. And once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. It becomes obvious that knowledge requires not just justification and truth, but the right connection between them. Requires that the truth be non-accidental, be because of rather than merely accompanied by the justification. And this seems like it should be easy to fix, should be easy to add to the definition. Just require that the belief be justified and true, and not Gettiered, not undermined by luck, not true by accident, and problem solved. But this is where the real trouble begins. Because no one can say what it means for a belief to be non-accidentally true. No one can define luck in a way that is not circular, not question-begging, not itself dependent on an intuitive grasp of what knowledge is. The natural move is to say that knowledge requires a reliable connection between belief and truth, that the method that produced the belief must be one that generally produces true beliefs. And this is reliabilism, the view that knowledge is reliably produced true belief. And this avoids Gettier cases because in Gettier cases, the belief is not reliably produced, the stopped clock is not a reliable method. The inference from the colleague's Ford to someone owning a Ford goes through an unreliable intermediate step. And so, reliabilism can say these are not knowledge because they fail the reliability condition. But reliabilism faces its own problems. It faces the generality problem, the question of how to specify the relevant type of belief. Forming process, because any process can be described at many levels of generality. Looking at a clock is a reliable process, but looking at this particular stopped clock is not. And which description is the right one? Which is the type that matters for knowledge? And there seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer this, no principle that determines the correct level of generality. And without such a principle, reliabilism cannot be applied, cannot deliver verdicts about particular cases, cannot do the work a theory of knowledge is supposed to do. Goldman tried to solve this with proper function, with the idea that the relevant process is the one that evolution, or learning, or some other natural process designed the cognitive system to perform. And this gives a non-arbitrary way to pick out process types, but it introduces new problems. Problems about what counts as proper function, about whether knowledge requires biological or social or individual design, about whether malfunction always destroys knowledge or only sometimes. And these questions proved as difficult as the original Gettier problem, generated their own literature, their own debates, their own unresolved puzzles. Others tried causal theories, theories that said knowledge requires a causal connection between the fact and the belief, that you can only know that Pi if P causes your belief that P, and this handles some Gettier cases. The stopped clock case involves no causal connection between the actual time and the belief about the time. But causal theories face problems with knowledge of abstract objects, with mathematical knowledge, with knowledge of the future, with any case where the thing known does not seem capable of causing beliefs, and the theory had to be abandoned or modified into something so hedged with qualifications that it lost its initial appeal, its initial promise of solving Gettier with a simple, elegant condition. Nozick proposed tracking, the idea that knowledge requires that the belief track the truth, that if P were false, the person would not believe P, and if P were true in nearby circumstances, the person would believe P, and this captures something important, captures the idea that knowledge involves a kind of sensitivity to truth, a responsiveness that is missing in Gettier cases. But tracking faces problems too. Problems with closure, the principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you can know Q by inference. Because tracking does not preserve closure. You can track one truth without tracking what it entails. And this means Nozick's theory implies you can know you have hands without knowing you are not a brain in a vat. And this seems wrong, seems like a bullet too large to bite. And most philosophers rejected tracking for this reason, even while acknowledging it captured something about knowledge that justified true belief missed. The pattern repeats endlessly. Someone proposes a fourth condition, someone finds a counterexample, the condition is modified, new counterexamples appear, the modifications multiply. The theory becomes baroque, loses its explanatory power, and eventually is abandoned in favour of a new approach that promises to avoid the problems of its predecessors. And this new approach inevitably faces its own counterexamples, its own difficulties, its own descent into complexity and qualification. And after 60 years of this, the epistemological community is no closer to a widely accepted definition of knowledge than it was when Gettier published his paper, and some have begun to suspect that this is not a temporary problem, not a sign that philosophers have not been clever enough, but a permanent feature of the concept of knowledge itself, a sign that knowledge resists analysis, that it cannot be captured in necessary and sufficient conditions, that the classical project of defining knowledge is not incomplete, but impossible. Williamson argued exactly this. He claimed that knowledge is primitive, that it cannot be analysed into more basic components, that it is a mental state in its own right, rather than a compound of belief and justification and truth. And this means the Gettier problem is not a problem to be solved, but a symptom of trying to do something that cannot be done, like trying to define yellow in terms of non-colour concepts, like trying to analyse consciousness into purely physical terms. And if Williamson is right, then all the attempts to fix the justified true belief analysis, all the fourth conditions and modifications and qualifications were doomed from the start. We're trying to define the undefinable, to analyse the primitive, and the right response is not to keep trying but to give up, to accept that knowledge is basic, that epistemology can still study its properties and relations without being able to define it, that not everything can be reduced to simpler components. But this seems like defeat, seems like giving up on philosophy's traditional task, and many resist it, continue to search for a definition, continue to propose new theories, new conditions, new ways of understanding the connection between belief and truth that knowledge requires. And this persistence is partly admirable, partly stubborn refusal to accept limits, and partly a failure to recognise when a project has failed, when the evidence is overwhelming that the goal is unreachable, that the concept being analysed is not structured the way analysis assumes, and the question is which interpretation is correct, whether continued work on the analysis of knowledge is noble persistence or futile stubbornness, whether the next theory might finally succeed or whether success is impossible. The externalism-internalism debate intersects with all of this, because Gettier cases reveal a tension between what the believer has access to and what makes belief knowledge. The person with justified true belief in a Gettier case cannot tell from the inside that they lack knowledge, cannot distinguish their situation from genuine knowledge by introspection or reflection. And this suggests that knowledge depends on external factors, on how the belief was actually formed, on whether the process was reliable, on whether the connection to truth was proper, and these are not things the believer necessarily has access to, not things that show up in consciousness, not things that can be known by reflection alone. And this means externalism is true. Knowledge is partly constituted by factors external to the mind, by relations to the environment that the knower may not be aware of. And this is deeply counterintuitive, deeply at odds with the Cartesian picture, where knowledge is transparent to the knower, where what one knows is fully accessible to reflection, where the mental is self-intimating and clear. But Gettier forces this conclusion, forces the recognition that knowledge can depend on facts. The knower does not, and perhaps cannot know, that there can be twins who are internally identical but differ in knowledge because they differ in environment. And this seems to violate something important about the nature of mind, about the privacy of the mental, about the authority each person has over their own beliefs. Yet the alternative seems worse, seems to deny that knowledge requires any external connection to reality at all, seems to make knowledge purely a matter of internal coherence or justification, and this would allow the brain in a vat to have knowledge, would make knowledge independent of truth, would sever the connection between mind and world that knowledge seems essentially to involve. The lottery paradox connects to Gettier through the problem of knowledge of conjunction. You know that ticket 1 will not win. You know that ticket 2 will not win. You know this for each ticket individually, because the probability of any ticket winning is negligible, but you cannot know that some ticket will win. Even though you know this must be true, and this seems wrong, seems like knowledge should be closed under conjunction, should allow you to put together things You know into knowledge of their conjunction, but if it does, then you can know both that no particular ticket will win and that some ticket will win. And these cannot both be known because they contradict. And this reveals something about the nature of knowledge, that it is not simply high probability, not simply justified belief that is very likely to be true, but something more demanding, something that excludes a certain kind of luck or chance. And this connects to Gettier because Gettier cases are cases where justified true belief holds, but knowledge fails because of luck, because of accident, because the truth was not guaranteed by the justification. And the lottery case suggests that knowledge requires guarantee, requires that the truth not be accidental. But what counts as guarantee? What excludes accident? These questions have no clear answer, no consensus, no definition that everyone accepts. Contextualism tries to solve some of these problems by saying that whether someone knows depends on context, on what alternatives are relevant, on how demanding the standards are in the conversational situation, and in ordinary contexts, knowledge is easy to have, requires only that obvious alternatives be ruled out. But in philosophical contexts where skeptical scenarios are raised, where brain-in-vat possibilities are mentioned, the standards rise and knowledge becomes harder or impossible to have. And this explains why knowledge seems to come and go, why we are happy to say we know things in ordinary life, but hesitate when doing philosophy. But contextualism faces problems too. Problems about whether the standards really vary or whether we are just more careful in philosophical contexts. Problems about how context determines standards. Problems about disagreement between people in different contexts who seem to be making incompatible claims. And like every other approach to knowledge after Gettier, contextualism captures something, but fails to capture everything, solves some problems, but creates others, and the dialectic continues, endlessly, inconclusively. Zagzebski showed that any analysis of knowledge that adds conditions to justified true belief to avoid Gettier will face its own Gettier-style counterexamples, that there is a recipe for generating such cases. And this is a kind of meta-Gettier problem, a problem not just with the original definition, but with the entire project of modifying it. And her argument suggests that the problem is not with particular proposals, but with the form of analysis itself, with the attempt to understand knowledge as justified true belief plus something. And if she's right, then the only options are to abandon analysis entirely, as Williamson suggests, or to abandon the justified true belief framework altogether, to start from scratch with a completely different approach. And some have tried this, have proposed that knowledge is a kind of ability, that it is acquaintance with facts, that it is constituted by the safety or sensitivity of belief, that it is a matter of having conclusive reasons, and each of these departs from the traditional framework. Each tries to rethink knowledge from the ground up, but each also faces objections. Each struggles to handle the full range of cases. Each eventually generates its own literature of problems and refinements and counterexamples. The phenomenon of epistemic luck is at the heart of all this. Gettier cases are cases of epistemic luck, cases where true belief is not the result of epistemic virtue or proper cognitive functioning, but of fortunate coincidence, and knowledge excludes epistemic luck. This much seems clear, but epistemic luck comes in many forms. Veritic luck, where the truth is accidental. Evidential luck, where the evidence is accidentally good. Content luck, where the belief happens to be about something true by coincidence. And maybe knowledge is incompatible with some forms of luck, but not others. Maybe some amount of luck is inevitable in any finite cognitive system operating in an uncertain world, and the question is where to draw the line. Which kinds of luck destroy knowledge and which do not? And there seems to be no principled way to answer this. No theory that gets all the cases right. No definition that excludes exactly the right amount of luck without excluding too much or too little. Sosa's virtue epistemology tries to handle this by saying that knowledge is true belief that is accurate because adroit, because of the exercise of cognitive ability, and Gettier cases fail because they are accurate, but not because adroit. The belief is true, but not because of skill, and this seems promising, seems to capture what goes wrong in Gettier cases, but it faces questions about what counts as ability, about whether being in a good environment is part of ability or a separate factor, about whether knowledge requires that ability be exercised in the right way, or just that it be exercised. And these questions prove difficult, generate their own debates, and the theory fragments into animal knowledge and reflective knowledge, and different grades of knowledge. And what started as a simple, elegant idea becomes complex and qualified and contested. The situationist challenge from social psychology raises doubts about whether cognitive abilities even exist, whether there are stable traits that manifest across situations, or whether behavior, including cognitive behavior, is mostly determined by situation rather than character. And if situationism is right, then virtue epistemology is based on a false assumption, based on the idea that people have stable cognitive abilities when really they have only situational responses. And this would not just undermine one theory of knowledge, but would call into question the entire picture of knowledge as something stable, something dispositional, something that inheres in persons rather than emerging from person-situation interactions. And while most epistemologists have not taken situationism seriously, have not fully grappled with its implications, it represents a potential crisis, a challenge from outside philosophy that could overturn assumptions epistemology has relied on for centuries. The Gettier problem has become emblematic of philosophy's condition, of its inability to solve problems definitively, to reach consensus, to make progress in the way sciences do, and critics point to 60 years of post-Gettier epistemology as evidence that philosophy is confused, that it asks questions that have no answers, that it pursues definitions that cannot be given, and defenders respond. That philosophy is hard, that concepts like knowledge are genuinely complex, that the lack of consensus is not failure, but the nature of inquiry into fundamental questions. But the defense sounds hollow after decades of effort that have produced no solution, no widely. Putnam sat in a room and imagined two planets, identical in every way, except one, Earth and twin Earth, perfect mirrors of each other down to the last atom, the last thought, the last whispered word, and on Earth there is water, H2O, the molecule that makes up oceans and rivers and rain, and on twin Earth there is also water, but it is not H2O, it is XYZ, a completely different substance with different chemical structure, different molecular bonds, different properties at the microscopic level. Yet to everyone living on twin Earth it looks exactly like water, tastes exactly like water, behaves exactly like water. It fills their lakes and falls from their clouds and quenches their thirst just as water does on Earth. Now imagine two people, one on Earth and one on twin Earth. Call them both Oscar, and these two Oscars are molecule for molecule identical. Same brain structure, same neural patterns, same memories, same thoughts, same internal psychological states. Everything inside their heads is exactly the same. And both Oscars look at a glass of liquid and say the word water. They both think they are referring to the same thing. They both believe they know what water is, but Putnam asks a simple question that shatters centuries of philosophy. Are they actually referring to the same thing? And the answer is no. Earth Oscar's word water refers to H2O. Twin Earth Oscar's word water refers to XYZ. Same word, same internal mental state, but different meanings, different references, different extensions in the world. And this means that meaning is not determined by what is in the head. Meaning is not a function of internal psychological states. Meaning is not private, not subjective, not locked inside the skull waiting to be discovered through introspection. The tradition, before Putnam, stretching back through Locke and Hume and Descartes, believed that meanings were mental entities, that words were connected to ideas in the mind, that reference was mediated by internal representations, by concepts, by mental images, and if you wanted to know what someone meant by a word, you had to look inside their head, examine their thoughts, map their mental contents, and this made sense, it felt right. It aligned with the intuition that language is personal, that each person has their own private understanding of words, their own associations, their own mental dictionary, but Putnam showed that this entire picture was wrong, that two people could have identical mental contents and still mean different things by the same word. That meaning reaches beyond the skull, beyond the brain, beyond psychology entirely, into the world itself, into the environment, into the physical and social context that determines what words actually refer to. This is semantic externalism, the view that meanings are not in the head but out in the world. That reference is determined not by internal states but by external relations, by causal connections between words and things, by the history of how a word came to be used, by the community of speakers who share the word, by the natural kinds that exist independently of human thought. And this means that you can be wrong about what you mean. You can use a word your entire life and not know what it really refers to. You can have perfect confidence in your understanding and still be completely mistaken, because meaning is not something you possess. It is something you participate in, something that exists in the space between speakers and world, between language and reality, between words and the things they pick out. Putnam's argument did not stop at twin earth. He pushed further. He talked about the division of linguistic labour, the fact that most people do not know the technical details of what their words refer to. Most people cannot define gold in terms of atomic number, cannot distinguish an elm from a beech, cannot explain what makes aluminum different from molybdenum. Yet they use these words successfully. They refer to these things accurately, and they do so not because they have the right mental contents, but because they are embedded in a community where some people do have the expertise, where metallurgists know about aluminum, where botanists know about elms, where chemists know about gold. And when ordinary speakers use these words, they defer to the experts. They rely on the division of labour. They trust that somewhere in the linguistic community there are people who know what these words really mean, who can distinguish the real thing from the fake. And this trust is what allows language to function, what allows reference to succeed even in the absence of individual knowledge. This overturns the Cartesian picture entirely. Descartes believed that knowledge began with the self, with the contents of consciousness, with what could be known through introspection, and from there one built outward to knowledge of the world. But Putnam showed that the order is reversed, that knowledge of meaning requires knowledge of the world first, that you cannot know what you mean without knowing what your words refer to, and you cannot know what your words refer to just by looking inside your own mind. You have to look outside to the physical environment, to the social context, to the history of usage, to the experts who maintain the standards of reference. And this means that the self is not the foundation of knowledge, but a participant in a larger system, a node in a network of linguistic and social relations that determine meaning collectively, not individually, externally, not internally. Frege tried to solve the problem of meaning differently. He distinguished between sense and reference, between the mode of presentation and the thing presented, and he believed that sense was in the mind, that it mediated reference, that two people could refer to the same thing through different senses, like the morning star and the evening star, both referring to Venus, and this preserved the idea that meaning had a mental component, that internal states mattered. But Putnam's argument cut through this because on twin earth, Oscar and his counterpart have the same sense, the same mode of presentation, the same mental mediation, but they do not have the same reference. They are not talking about the same substance, and this means that sense alone does not determine reference, that no amount of mental content can fix what a word picks out in the world. that reference requires something beyond sense, beyond psychology, beyond anything that can be captured by introspection or phenomenology. Kripke reinforced this from another angle. He argued that names and natural kind terms were rigid designators, that they referred to the same thing in all possible worlds, not by virtue of satisfying a description, but by virtue of causal historical chains, that the word water refers to H2O because it was introduced to refer to a certain substance, and that reference was passed down through generations of speakers, through baptism and transmission, through ostension and use. And even if speakers lost track of what the substance was, even if they forgot its chemical composition, even if they developed false beliefs about it, the words still referred to the same thing, because reference is not determined by beliefs but by the causal connection between word and world, by the chain that links current usage back to the original act of naming, back to the moment when the word was first attached to the thing. This has radical implications for psychology, because it means psychology cannot determine reference, cannot tell you what your words mean, cannot give you the extension of your terms just by examining your mental states. And this was a blow to cognitive science, to theories of mind that tried to explain language purely in terms of internal representations, in terms of concepts and mental models and computational processes, because Putnam and Kripke showed that none of this is enough. That meaning leaks out of the head, that it requires the world, requires the community, requires the causal historical context. And without these external factors, there is no meaning at all. Just empty sounds, just syntax without semantics, just symbols shuffling around inside the skull with no connection to reality. Yet people resist this conclusion. They cling to the intuition that they know what they mean, that their words are transparent to them. That meaning is something they possess and control. And this resistance is understandable because semantic externalism is deeply unsettling. It suggests that we are strangers to our own language, that we do not fully understand the words we speak, that meaning is not something we create, but something we inherit, something we are thrown into, something that precedes us and exceeds us and determines what we can say before we even open our mouths. Wittgenstein saw this too, though from a different direction. He argued that meaning is use, that words get their meaning from the language games they are embedded in, from the forms of life that give them context. And he rejected the idea of private language, the idea that meaning could be purely internal, purely subjective, because a private language would have no standards of correctness, no way to distinguish between following a rule and merely thinking one is following a rule. And without standards, there is no meaning, just the illusion of meaning, just the feeling of understanding without actual understanding. And this is why language must be public, why it must be shared, why it requires a community of speakers who can correct each other, who can point out mistakes, who can maintain the norms that make reference possible. Putnam took this further. He showed not just that language is public, but that meaning is not even fully determined by the community, that it reaches beyond the community into the world itself, that natural kind terms like water and gold and tiger refer to whatever has the same underlying nature as the paradigm samples, the same deep structure, the same essential properties, and this means that meaning can outrun knowledge, that a community can use a word correctly even when they have false beliefs about what they are referring to, even when their theories are wrong, even when their understanding is incomplete, because the word latches onto the real essence, the objective structure, the natural kind that exists independently of human thought. And the world itself constrains meaning, corrects mistakes, determines reference in ways that no internal psychological state can capture. This is why Aristotle was not wrong when he talked about water, even though he did not know about molecules, even though his theory of elements was false. He was still referring to H2O because his word water was causally connected to the same substance our word water refers to, because the reference was fixed not by his beliefs, but by the stuff itself, by the samples he pointed to, by the liquid he drank and swam in and observed, and the continuity of reference across theory change, across conceptual revolutions, across the abandonment of entire frameworks, shows that meaning is anchored in the world, not in the mind, that it survives the death of theories because it was never dependent on theories in the first place. But this raises a puzzle. If meaning is not in the head, if psychological states do not determine reference, then what role does the mind play at all? What is psychology supposed to study if not meaning, if not the contents of thought, if not the representations that mediate between language and world? And Putnam's answer is that psychology studies something real. It studies mental states. It studies computational processes. It studies the functional organization of cognition, but it does not study meaning, because meaning is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a semantic phenomenon. It is a relation between words and world, between signs and reference, between language and reality. And this relation is not mediated by anything in the head. It is direct. It is external. It is constituted by causal and social factors that lie beyond the reach of introspection, beyond the scope of neuroscience, beyond the explanatory power of any psychological theory. Fodor resisted this. He wanted to preserve a role for internal content, for narrow content, for something in the head that could do explanatory work. And he argued that even if meaning is wide, even if reference is external, there must be something narrow that explains behavior, some internal state that mediates between input and output, some mental representation that the cognitive system manipulates. And he tried to carve out a space for psychology by distinguishing between wide content, which depends on the environment, and narrow content, which does not, which is purely internal, purely psychological, purely computational. But this move was always unstable because narrow content turned out to be elusive, hard to define, hard to individuate, hard to see how it could play the explanatory role Fodor wanted it to play. And many philosophers concluded that narrow content was a myth, that there was no such thing, that all content was wide, that meaning was always externalist, always dependent on factors beyond the head, and if psychology wanted to explain behavior, it would have to appeal to wide content, to states that are individuated by their relations to the environment, to representations that are only representations in virtue of their connections to what they represent. This is deeply counterintuitive, because it means that two people in identical internal states could be thinking different thoughts, could be believing different things, could be referring to different objects, just because they are in different environments, just because their words have different causal histories, just because the world around them is structured differently. And this seems to violate the intuition that mental states are internal, that what you're thinking is determined by what is going on inside your head, that consciousness is private, that the contents of experience are immediately accessible to introspection. But Putnam and Kripke showed that this intuition is wrong, that mental states are not self-intimating, that you can be mistaken about what you're thinking, that the meanings of your thoughts depend on facts about the world that you may not know, that reference is opaque, that you can use words successfully without understanding what they mean, that language works not because speakers have perfect knowledge, but because they are embedded in networks of reference that do the work for them, that connect words to things through mechanisms that operate below the level of consciousness, below the level of intentional control. Burge extended this argument to mental content itself. He argued that not just linguistic meaning, but thought itself is individuated externally, that beliefs and desires are identified by their relations to the environment, that you could not have a belief about water if you lived in a world with no water, that mental content is essentially relational, essentially dependent on what exists outside the mind, and this means that the mind is not a self-contained system, not a module that could be studied in isolation, not a computational device that processes inputs according to internal rules, but an open system, a system that is constituted by its interactions with the world, that is shaped by its environment, that cannot be understood without reference to the physical and social context it is embedded in. This has implications for artificial intelligence, for the question of whether machines can think, because if meaning is external, if reference depends on causal historical connections, if mental content is individuated by relations to the environment, then a computer program, no matter how sophisticated, cannot have genuine thoughts unless it has the right connections to the world, unless it is embedded in the right kind of causal network, unless it participates in the same linguistic and social practices that give human words their meanings. And this suggests that thought is not just computation, not just symbol manipulation, not just syntactic operations on formal structures, but something that requires embodiment, requires situatedness, requires participation in a form of life, and a brain in a vat, no matter how complex its internal processes, would not be thinking about water or trees or anything else, because its words would not be connected to anything, would not refer to anything, would be empty symbols with no semantic content, no meaning, no reference, just syntax running in a void. Putnam himself later came to doubt some of his own arguments. He worried that semantic externalism led to metaphysical realism, to the view that there is a fixed, determinate way the world is, independent of human conceptual schemes, independent of language, independent of theory, and he came to think this was incoherent, that it made reference magical, that it required a God's eye view, a perspective from nowhere that could compare words to things without being situated in any particular framework, and he moved toward internal realism, toward the view that truth and reference are always relative to a conceptual scheme, always dependent on the practices and norms of a community, always constrained by what Quine called the tribunal of experience, but never fully determined by it. And this introduced a tension, a pull between the external world that constrains reference and the internal practices that constitute meaning, a tension that Putnam never fully resolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, because meaning lives in that tension, in the space between mind and world, between language and reality, between what we intend and what our words actually pick out. Dennett approached this from yet another angle. He argued that meaning is not a real property but a useful fiction, that intentional states are not natural kinds but interpretive stances, that when we attribute beliefs and desires, we are not discovering facts about the mind but adopting a strategy for predicting behaviour. And from this perspective, the question of whether meaning is in the head or in the world dissolves. Because meaning is not anywhere, it is not a real thing but a pattern we impose, a way of organising our understanding of complex systems. And the intentional stance works whether we apply it to humans or thermostats or chess programs. The difference is just pragmatic, just a matter of what level of description is most useful for prediction and explanation. Not a matter of what really has meaning and what does not, because nothing really has meaning. Meaning is always an interpretation, always a projection, always a way of seeing that could be otherwise. But this seems too deflationary, too quick to dismiss the felt reality of meaning, the undeniable sense that words do connect to things, that thoughts are about the world. That reference is not just a useful fiction but a real relation, and even if we cannot fully explain how this relation works, even if semantic externalism leaves gaps and puzzles, it at least takes seriously the intuition that language matters, that what we say makes a difference, that truth is not just coherence within a system but correspondence with reality, however elusive and problematic that correspondence may be. And to give up on this, to reduce meaning to a mere interpretive stance, feels like giving up on something essential, something worth preserving even if we cannot fully explain it, even if it leads to paradoxes and tensions that resist resolution. Because the alternative is a world where nothing means anything, where language floats free of reality, where thought is cut loose from the world, and that is a world too empty, too barren, too divorced from lived experience to be acceptable, even if it is theoretically cleaner, even if it avoids the hard problems, even if it makes philosophy easier by making meaning disappear. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see, cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection, to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy. From the earliest moments, when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. And the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity. And the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated. And the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable. And the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation. And the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people. But the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection, and the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition. And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them, and the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed. And the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity without this integration is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. And the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self, and the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation, and the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible, and the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available, and the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity, and identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated, and the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce, but the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices, and the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face, and the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition, and recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly. And the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual. And the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity, and identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation. And mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually. And visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, when external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal. And the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors, and mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back. And what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, and identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation, and mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable. And recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown. And the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had. And the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection. Shame is not emotion but is technology, is the mechanism through which groups control individuals, through which societies enforce norms, through which collectives ensure conformity without the need for constant surveillance, constant punishment, constant external force, because the force becomes internal, becomes the voice inside that judges, that condemns, that produces the feeling of being fundamentally wrong, fundamentally defective, fundamentally unworthy. And this feeling is more powerful than any external punishment, is more effective than any threat, is the weapon that societies have perfected over millennia, the conversion of social judgment into self-judgment, the transformation of external control into internal monitoring. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every decision, in every thought that might deviate from what is acceptable, what is expected, what is required. And the requirement is not explicit, is not written down, is absorbed through observation, through imitation, through the 1,000 small corrections that shape children into members of the group. And the shaping is violent, is coercive, is the moulding of consciousness to fit the pattern that the society demands. And the demands vary by culture, by context, by what behaviours serve the group's interests. But the mechanism is universal, is present in every society, is the way that humans have solved the problem of coordination, the problem of getting individuals to behave in ways that benefit the collective, even when those behaviours conflict with individual interest, and the conflict is constant. Is the tension between what the self wants and what the group requires? And shame is what tips the balance, is what makes the group's requirements feel like the self's requirements, is what converts external judgment into internal compulsion. And the compulsion is not experienced as coercion, but as conscience, as the sense of right and wrong that seems to come from within, but is really coming from the group, from the internalized voices of parents, of peers, of authorities, of all the representatives of social norms who have spoken, and whose speaking has been absorbed, has been converted into the inner voice that judges, that shames, that produces the feeling that is unbearable, that is worse than pain. That is the sense of being exposed, of being seen in one's wrongness, in one's defectiveness, in one's failure to meet the standards that everyone else seems to meet effortlessly. And the effortlessness is illusion, is the result of successful internalization, is what happens when shame has done its work, when the external has become internal, when the monitoring is so automatic that it feels like nature, like the way things are, like the voice of truth rather than the voice of power. And power is what shame is the exercise of control, is the way that the group extends its reach into the individual, into the mind, into the private space where decisions are made. And the decisions are not free, are not autonomous, are shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of exposure, by the need to maintain the facade of being acceptable, of being worthy, of being someone who meets the standards. And the standards are impossible, are designed to be impossible, are set high enough that everyone fails, that everyone is vulnerable to shame, that everyone needs the group's forgiveness, the group's acceptance, the group's willingness to overlook the failures, as long as the proper contrition is shown, the proper submission is performed, the proper deference is given to the norms that were violated, and the violation is inevitable, is guaranteed, is the way that shame maintains its power. Because if everyone could meet the standards, then shame would lose its force, would become irrelevant, would no longer be useful for control. And so the standards are calibrated, are adjusted, are maintained at the level where most people are failing most of the time, are feeling inadequate, are needing reassurance, are seeking validation. And the seeking is the mechanism, is the way that shame produces conformity, produces obedience, produces the constant effort to be good, to be acceptable, to be worthy of belonging. And belonging is what is at stake, is what shame threatens, is the thing that will be lost if the shame is too great, if the exposure is too complete, if the judgment is too severe. And the severity is variable, is depending on culture, on context, on what the group needs to enforce. And what it needs to enforce varies, is different in honor cultures, where shame is about reputation, about the family's standing, about the public face that must be maintained. and in guilt cultures where shame is about internal. States about intentions, about the purity of the conscience, and the conscience is the internalized judge, is the voice that speaks even when no one is watching, that produces guilt even in private, that makes the internal monitoring as effective as external surveillance, and the effectiveness is what makes guilt cultures powerful, is what allows them to function with less overt control, with less public punishment. Because the punishment is internal, is the guilt that gnaws, that torments, that produces the feeling of being wrong, even when the behavior is hidden, even when the transgression is secret. And the secret is what guilt cultures target, is what they make unbearable, is what they convert into shame through the internalization of norms, through the creation of conscience, through the training of the inner voice to judge, to condemn, to produce the feeling that is worse than any external punishment. And the worse is the genius of the system, is the efficiency of shame, is the way that control becomes self-control, that power becomes invisible, that coercion becomes choice, and the choice is not free but is shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of guilt, by the need to avoid the feeling that is unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is the emotion that is more painful than physical pain, that is more threatening than external danger, that is triggering the same neural circuits as social death, as exile, as the exclusion that in ancestral environments meant literal death, meant the end of survival. And so the fear of shame is ancient, is hardwired, is operating at levels deeper than reason, deeper than conscious thought, is producing reactions that are automatic, that are visceral, that are overwhelming. And the overwhelming is what makes shame effective, is what makes it useful for control, is what makes it the primary mechanism through which societies enforce norms, maintain order, ensure that individuals behave in ways that serve the collective. And the serving is not voluntary, is not chosen, is coerced through shame, through the threat of exposure, through the fear of judgment. And the judgment is constant, is omnipresent, is coming from others and from the self, from the internalized voices that have become the conscience, the superego, the inner critic that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to feel acceptable, to feel worthy, to feel free from the threat of shame. And the threat is maintained through public shaming, through the rituals that expose transgressions, that make violations visible, that demonstrate what happens to those who break the rules. And the demonstration is warning, is deterrent, is the reminder that shame is always possible, is always lurking, is always ready to destroy the reputation, the standing, the sense of belonging that makes life bearable. And the bearable is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it uses as leverage to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power is distributed according to the rules, and the rules are not natural, are not discovered, are imposed, are created by those who benefit from them, by those who have power, by those who use shame to maintain their position, to prevent challenge, to ensure that those below stay below, that those who are shamed remain shamed, that the hierarchy is preserved. And the preservation is what shame serves, is what it accomplishes, is the maintenance of order through the creation of internal monitoring, through the transformation of social control into self-control. And the self-control is not freedom, but is the most perfect form of slavery, is the condition where the chains are invisible, where the prison is internal, where the guard is the self, and the self cannot escape, cannot rebel, cannot refuse, because the refusal would produce shame, would trigger the feeling that is unbearable, would expose the self to judgment. And the judgment is what is feared most, is what drives behavior, is what makes people do things they do not want to do, believe things they do not believe, perform roles they do not choose, because the alternative is shame, is exposure, is the loss of belonging, and belonging is survival, is the thing that makes life possible, that makes existence tolerable, that provides meaning and purpose and the sense that one matters. And mattering is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it holds hostage. And the hostage is the self, is the identity that is constructed through the internalization of norms, through the absorption of judgments, through the acceptance of the standards that the group imposes, and the imposing is not negotiable, is not optional, is the price of membership, the cost of belonging, the requirement for survival. And survival requires shame, requires the capacity to feel it, to be shaped by it, to use it to regulate behavior, to monitor thought, to police the boundaries of the acceptable. And the acceptable is narrow, is constrained, is defined by the group, and the group's definition is arbitrary, is variable, is serving interests that are not the individual's interests, that are the interests of power, of hierarchy, of the maintenance of the order that benefits some at the expense of others. And the others are kept in place through shame, through the feeling that they are less, that they are wrong, that they are unworthy, and the unworthiness is not fact but is assignment, is the judgment that the group makes, that the individual internalizes, that becomes the truth of the self, the core belief around which identity is organized, and the organization is pathological, is producing suffering, is creating the sense that the self is fundamentally defective, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally deserving of the judgment, and the judgment is harsh, is relentless, is coming from within and without, from the self and from others, and the others are always watching, always judging, always ready to shame. And the readiness is maintained through public shaming, through the revival of practices that were thought to be barbaric, to be outdated, to be incompatible with modern values, but are returning, are being embraced, are being used with new technologies, with social media, with the platforms that make public shaming instantaneous, global, permanent. And the permanence is new, is the addition that technology brings, is the way that shame now lasts forever, is recorded, is searchable, is never forgotten. And the never forgotten is the enhancement of shame, is the intensification of its power, is the conversion of temporary judgment into permanent stigma. And the stigma is the mark, is the label, is the thing that defines the person, that reduces them to their failure, to their transgression, to the moment when they were exposed, when they were judged, when they were shamed. And the shaming is not correction, is not education, is not intended to help, but is intended to punish, to exclude, to destroy. And the destruction is what public shaming achieves, is what it is designed to do, is the elimination of the person from the community, from the acceptable, from the realm of those who matter. And the mattering is what is taken away, is what shame removes, is what is lost when the judgment is public, when the exposure is complete, when the person becomes the embodiment of wrongness, of defectiveness, of unworthiness, and the unworthiness is total, is overwhelming, is the condition that produces not just embarrassment, but the deeper shame, the toxic shame, the shame that is not about what one did, but about what one is, and the is the problem, is the conversion of behavior into identity, is the judgment that extends from the action to the actor, from the mistake to the person, from the moment to the essence. And the essence is what shame targets, is what it damages, is what it destroys, is the sense of being fundamentally acceptable, fundamentally worthy, fundamentally deserving of existence. And the existence becomes questionable, becomes something that must be justified, must be earned, must be proven through the constant performance of acceptability, and the performance is exhausting, is impossible, is the burden that shame creates, is the weight that is carried by everyone who has internalized the judgment, who has absorbed the norms, who has become the monitor of their own behavior. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is producing anxiety, is producing the sense that at any moment the failure might happen, the exposure might occur, the shame might descend, and the descending is what is feared, is what drives the performance, is what makes people desperate to be good, to be acceptable, to be beyond reproach. And the beyond reproach is impossible, is unattainable, is the standard that ensures everyone is vulnerable, everyone is exposed, everyone is subject to shame. And the subject is the self, is the identity that is constructed through shame, that is defined by the internalized judgments, that is shaped by the fear of exposure. And the exposure is what social media enables, is what the digital age amplifies, is the possibility that at any moment anything might be revealed, anything might be judged, anything might become the basis for public shaming. And the basis is often trivial, is often a mistake, is often something that in another context would be ignored, would be forgotten, would be forgiven, but in the context of public shaming becomes unforgivable, becomes the thing that defines, that destroys, that reduces the person to the object of judgment, to the target of collective rage, to the scapegoat that the group needs, that the society uses, that shame requires. Because shame is not just individual, but is collective, is not just personal, but is social, is not just feeling, but is function, is the mechanism through which groups maintain cohesion, through which societies enforce norms, through which power maintains itself, and the maintenance is achieved through the constant threat of shame, through the ever-present possibility of exposure, through the fear that keeps people in line, keeps them conforming, keeps them performing the roles that the society assigns. And the assignment is not chosen, is not negotiated, is imposed through shame, through the feeling that to deviate is to be wrong, to be defective, to be unworthy. And the unworthiness is the lever, is the tool, is the way that power operates, is the currency that shame represents, is the thing that is spent, that is accumulated, that is traded in the social economy, where reputation is wealth, where honour is capital, where shame is debt, and the debt is inherited, is passed down, is the legacy of transgression, is what families carry, what lineages bear, what communities cannot escape. Because shame is not just about the individual, but is about the group, is about the collective honour that must be maintained, that must be protected, that must be defended against the contamination of shame. And the contamination is what happens when one member transgresses, when one person is exposed, when one individual brings shame upon the family, upon the community, upon the collective. And the collective responds with punishment, with exclusion, with the violence that is justified by the need to restore honour, to remove the stain, to eliminate the source of shame. And the elimination can be social, can be physical, can be the death that honour cultures prescribe, that honour killings enforce, that the logic of shame demands when the transgression is too great, when the exposure is too complete, when the only way to restore honour is to destroy the source of dishonour, and the destruction is murder, is violence, is the extreme form of shame's power, is what happens when shame is not just emotion, but is law, is not just feeling, but is justice, is not just internal, but is external, is enforced not just by conscience, but by the community. And the community is the enforcer, is the judge, is the executioner, is the thing that makes shame lethal, that makes shame literal death. And the death is what shame has always threatened, is what it has always implied, is what it is metaphorically, and sometimes literally, producing, is the end of social existence, the end of belonging, the end of the self as recognised, as valued, as mattering. And the mattering is what makes life worth living, is what makes existence bearable, is what shame takes away, is what shame holds hostage, is what shame uses to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power remains distributed according to the rules. And the rules are maintained through shame, are enforced through guilt, are perpetuated through the internalization of judgment, through the conversion of external control into internal monitoring, through the creation of the conscience that is not freedom, but is the most sophisticated form of slavery, is the condition where the individual has become the agent of their own oppression, has become the enforcer of the norms that harm them, has become the voice that judges, that shames, that makes life unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is what it is designed to produce, is the mechanism through which societies control individuals, through which power maintains itself, through which the currency of shame is spent, is accumulated, is traded, is the thing that makes social life possible, that makes coordination achievable, that makes conformity enforceable, and the enforcement is continuous, is total, is the permanent condition of social existence, is the cost of belonging, is the price of survival, is the burden that everyone carries, is the weight of shame, of guilt, of the internalized judgment that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to be free, to be acceptable, to be beyond the reach of shame. And the reach is infinite, is extending into every moment, every decision, every thought, is the omnipresent threat that keeps people in line, that makes them perform, that makes them conform, that makes them serve the group even when the group is serving power, is maintaining hierarchy, is preserving the order that benefits the few at the expense of the many, and the many are controlled through shame, are kept in place through guilt, are made to believe that their suffering is their fault, is their failure, is their unworthiness, and the unworthiness is the lie, is the mechanism, is the currency of shame, is what keeps the system running, what makes power invisible, what converts coercion into choice, and the choice is not free but is shaped by shame, by guilt, by the fear of judgment, by the anticipation of exposure, by the threat that is always there, always present, always ready to descend, and the descending is what everyone fears, is what everyone avoids, is what everyone works to prevent, and the preventing is the work, is the performance, is the conformity, is the submission, is the acceptance of the norms, the internalization of the judgment, the absorption of the shame that is the currency, that is the mechanism, that is the way that societies control, that power maintains itself, that individuals are shaped into members of the group, and the shaping is violence, is coercion, is the transformation of the self into the thing that the group needs, and the need is conformity, is obedience, is the willingness to carry the shame, to feel the guilt, to be the subject of judgment, and the subject is what shame creates, is what guilt produces, is the self that is never free, never acceptable, never beyond the reach of the currency that is shame, that is guilt, that is the mechanism through which humanity controls itself, enforces its norms, maintains its order, and the order is maintained through suffering, through the feeling that is unbearable, through the emotion that is technology, through the currency of shame. Attention has become currency, has become the raw material that corporations extract and refine and sell, and this transformation happened quietly, happened gradually, happened so smoothly that most people did not notice they were becoming the product, did not realize that their consciousness had been colonized, that the hours of their lives were being auctioned to the highest bidder, that every moment of awareness was being monetized by platforms designed not to inform or connect or entertain, but to harvest, to capture, to hold the gaze for as long as possible and convert that holding into profit. And the genius of this system is that it does not feel like exploitation, does not feel like theft, feels instead like choice, like freedom, like the vast menu of options that modernity provides. But the choice is curated, is algorithmically optimized, is designed to keep the user inside the platform, inside the feed, inside the cycle of stimulus and response that generates data. And the data is what matters. The data is what gets sold. The clicks and scrolls and pauses and searches that reveal preferences, reveal psychology, reveal the patterns that allow prediction. And prediction is control, is the ability to shape behavior, to nudge decisions, to make certain choices more likely than others. And this happens below the level of awareness, happens in the gap between stimulus and response, happens so quickly that by the time consciousness arrives to claim authorship of the decision has already been made, has been influenced by factors that were carefully engineered to be invisible, to operate in the blind spots of perception. And the engineers are not evil, are not villains, are just optimizing, are just doing what they are hired to do, which is maximize engagement. And engagement is measured in time, in how many minutes per day the user spends inside the system. And the system is very good at maximizing this metric, has been refined through millions of iterations, has been tested on billions of users, has discovered principles of human psychology that academic researchers never found, because researchers have ethics committees and platforms have incentives, and the incentive is to find the exact frequency of reward that keeps behavior going, the exact ratio of novelty to familiarity that prevents habituation, the exact level of difficulty that maintains interest without causing frustration, and these parameters are adjusted in real time, are personalized for each user, are tuned to the individual vulnerabilities that the data reveals. And what the data reveals is that humans are predictable, are hackable, are machines that respond to inputs in ways that can be modeled and exploited. And the exploitation is not illegal, is not even considered unethical by the standards of the industry, is just business, just capitalism, just the market finding new territory to colonize. And the territory is consciousness, is the hours of the day that used to be empty, used to be boring, used to be filled with thought or rest or staring at walls. And these empty hours were not profitable, were not monetizable, were waste from an economic perspective, and so they had to be filled, had to be captured, had to be converted into engagement. And the tools for this conversion are apps, are platforms, are devices that promise connection and deliver isolation, promise information and deliver distraction, promise empowerment and deliver addiction. And the addiction is not metaphorical, is not exaggeration, is literal, is the same neural pathways, the same dopamine dynamics, the same withdrawal symptoms that characterize substance addiction. And the platforms know this, have hired neuroscientists and psychologists to make the products more addictive, more compelling, more difficult to resist, and resistance is framed as weakness, as lack of self-control, as personal failing. But this framing obscures the asymmetry of power, obscures the fact that individuals are competing against teams of PhDs with unlimited resources and sophisticated tools. And in this competition, the individual always loses, always ends up scrolling, always ends up checking, always ends up giving the platform what it wants, which is attention. And attention is finite, is the one resource that cannot be manufactured or expanded, is strictly limited by the hours in a day and the capacity of the nervous system. And so the competition for attention is zero-sum, is a war where every platform is fighting every other platform, and all of them are fighting against sleep and work and relationships and anything else that might occupy consciousness. And the platforms are winning, are capturing more hours every year, are extending their reach into moments that used to be sacred, used to be protected, used to be offline. And offline is becoming a luxury, is becoming something only the wealthy can afford, because opting out requires discipline and alternatives and the knowledge that opting out is even possible. And most people do not have this knowledge, do not see the system, do not recognize that their attention is being farmed. And even those who do recognize it often cannot escape, cannot resist, because the platforms are too useful, too convenient, too integrated into the infrastructure of modern life. And to reject them is to reject participation, to accept isolation, to make life harder in exchange for autonomy. And most choose convenience over autonomy, choose connection over sovereignty, choose the platform over the void. And the void is what waits in the absence of stimulation, is what the constant connectivity is designed to prevent, is boredom, is the experience of being alone with the unoccupied mind. And boredom has become intolerable, has become something to be avoided at all costs. And the cost is attention, is consciousness, is the capacity to think without distraction, to feel without mediation, to simply be without needing external input. And this capacity is atrophying, is declining with each generation, is being bred out by an environment that never stops demanding response, that never allows rest, that treats every moment of inactivity as opportunity, as potential engagement that must be captured. And the capturing is called user experience, is called interface design, is called growth hacking. And these terms sanitize what is happening, make it sound technical rather than predatory, make it sound like optimization rather than exploitation. But the experience of the user is not optimized for the user, is optimized for the platform, is designed to extract maximum value from minimum input. And the value extracted is not just attention, but data, not just time, but information, not just engagement, but identity, because the platforms know things about their users that the users do not know about themselves, have models of personality and preference that are more accurate than self-report. And these models are sold, are licensed, are used to manipulate. And the manipulation is called advertising, but is really behavior modification, is the application of psychological principles to make certain actions more likely. And the actions are clicking and buying and voting and believing. And what is believed is whatever the algorithm decides to show. Whatever content the model predicts will generate engagement. And engagement means time, means attention, means the user staying inside the system. And the system has learned that outrage generates engagement, that fear generates engagement, that tribalism and conflict and moral certainty generate engagement. And so these are what the algorithm promotes, what the feed becomes filled with, not because the platform wants a more divided world, but because division is profitable, keeps people scrolling, keeps people arguing, keeps attention captured. And the captured attention is sold to advertisers who want to change behavior, who want to make people buy products they do not need, believe things that are not true, vote for candidates who do not serve their interests. And the system works, is terrifyingly effective, has changed elections, has changed culture, has changed what people think is real, and reality is becoming whatever the algorithm amplifies, whatever goes viral, whatever captures attention long enough to become part of the discourse. And the discourse is not conversation but performance, not exchange but broadcast, not thinking but reacting. And reaction is what the system wants, is faster than reflection, is more primitive, is easier to predict and manipulate. And so the environment rewards reaction, punishes reflection, makes it difficult to think slowly, to consider carefully, to withhold judgment. And the result is a population that is always responding, always reacting, always engaged but never thoughtful, never deliberate, never in control of their own attention. And attention is the foundation of everything else, is what makes learning possible, makes relationships possible, makes meaning possible. And when attention is colonized, everything built on attention becomes precarious, becomes shallow, becomes vulnerable to collapse. And the collapse is already happening, is visible in the epidemic of anxiety and depression, in the inability to focus, in the fragmentation of identity, in the sense that life is accelerating, that there is never enough time, that something important is being lost, but it is not clear what or how to get it back. And what is being lost is sovereignty, is the right to one's own consciousness, the right to choose what to pay attention to, rather than having attention hijacked, manipulated, sold. And the platforms will say that users have choice, that no one is forced to use these services, that opting out is always possible. But this is disingenuous, is like saying that people choose to breathe polluted air because they could move, could leave the city, could find somewhere clean. And technically, this is true, but practically, it ignores the structure of power, ignores that the environment has been changed in ways that make certain choices extremely costly. That opting out of the attention economy means opting out of employment, education, social connection, civic participation. And so the choice is not really a choice. is coerced by circumstance, by the fact that the platforms have become infrastructure, have become the roads on which modern life travels. And to refuse them is to refuse modernity, to accept marginalization, and most cannot afford this refusal. And so they stay, keep scrolling, keep checking, keep giving away their attention and receiving in return the feeling of being connected, being informed, being free, when really they are isolated, distracted, captured. And the freedom is the freedom of the hamster wheel, the freedom to run without going anywhere, the freedom to choose between options that have all been curated to serve the same end, and the end is profit, is the conversion of attention into money, is the monetization of consciousness itself. And this monetization was not possible before, was not technically feasible, required technologies that did not exist, required smartphones and algorithms, and the infrastructure to track and analyze and predict behavior in real time. And now that the infrastructure exists, it will not be dismantled, will not be voluntarily abandoned, because it's too valuable, too profitable, too central to the business models of the most powerful corporations in history. And these corporations are not accountable to users, are accountable to shareholders. And shareholders care about growth, care about returns, care about the numbers going up. And the numbers go up when engagement goes up, when attention is captured more effectively, when the competition is crushed and the market is monopolized. And monopoly is what has been achieved, is what the platform economy tends toward, because platforms benefit from network effects, from being where everyone else is. And this creates winner-take-all dynamics, creates situations where one or two platforms dominate, and alternatives cannot compete, cannot offer enough value to overcome the switching costs. And so the users are locked in, are prisoners of convenience, are unable to leave without losing access to the networks that have become essential. And the platforms know this, exploit this, degrade the experience slowly, introduce features that users hate but tolerate because the alternative is worse, is disconnection. And disconnection is unthinkable, has become synonymous with isolation, has become the thing that the attention economy promises to save us from while actually delivering it. Because connection through a screen is not connection, is simulation of connection, is the appearance without the substance, is the feeling without the reality. And the reality is that real connection requires presence, requires attention that is not divided, not distracted, not mediated by an algorithm that is optimizing for something other than the relationship. And such attention is becoming rare, is becoming a gift that few can afford to give, because attention is the thing being taken, is the thing being sold, is the thing that there is never enough of, because it is always being redirected, always being pulled toward the next notification, the next update, the next thing designed to capture and hold and extract. And the extraction is invisible, feels like nothing, feels like just a moment, just a quick check, just staying informed. But the moments accumulate, the checks compound, and hours dissolve into fragmented minutes, into broken attention that cannot sustain thought, cannot maintain focus, cannot build anything that requires depth or complexity or sustained engagement. And depth is what is being lost, is what the attention economy is incompatible with, because depth requires time, requires the ability to stay with difficulty, to tolerate confusion, to sit with questions that do not have immediate answers. And the platforms cannot tolerate this, cannot allow users to sit, must keep them moving, must keep them scrolling, must keep them in the state of perpetual seeking that never finds, perpetual consuming that never satisfies. And satisfaction is the enemy, is what would cause the user to stop, to disengage, to leave the platform. And so satisfaction must be prevented, must be deferred, must be replaced with the promise of satisfaction, with the feeling that the next thing will be the thing, the next scroll will reveal something worth the time. And this promise is never fulfilled, is never intended to be fulfilled, is the mechanism that keeps the machine running, keeps the user trapped in the loop. and escape requires recognizing the loop, requires seeing the mechanism, requires understanding that the feeling of freedom is the trap, that the choice is the cage, that the attention economy is not serving the user but is using the user, is extracting value and leaving behind exhaustion, fragmentation, the sense that life is happening somewhere else, to someone else, and the screen is a window onto that other life. But never a door, never a way through, only a way to watch, to consume, to experience vicariously, and vicarious experience is not experience, is its negation, is the replacement of doing with watching, of living with scrolling, of being with performing, and performance is what the platforms demand. Demand the curation of identity, the presentation of self that is always positive, always successful, always enviable, and this performance is exhausting, is alienating, is the source of the anxiety that drives people back to the platforms looking for relief. And the platforms provide relief in the form of more content, more distraction, more opportunities to forget that the self being performed is not the self being lived, that the gap between them is growing, that authenticity is becoming impossible in an environment that punishes vulnerability and rewards spectacle. And spectacle is what the algorithm amplifies. What goes viral, what captures attention at scale, and attention at scale is what matters, is what generates revenue, is what makes certain voices loud and others silent, and the silence is not absence but erasure, is the algorithmic decision that certain content does not generate engagement, does not deserve distribution, does not align with the platform's interests, and interests are commercial, are about keeping users inside the system, and anything that might cause users to leave, to think, to question, to disconnect, is deprioritized, is hidden, is effectively censored not by decree but by code, by the automated decisions of systems that have no conception of truth or value or importance, only of engagement, and engagement is the wrong metric, is optimizing for the wrong thing, is maximizing time spent rather than time well spent, and the distinction matters because not all attention is equal. Some attention is nourishing and some is depleting. Some makes life richer and some makes it poorer, but the algorithm cannot distinguish, does not care, measures only duration and intensity. And intensity is easy to generate through outrage, through fear, through the triggering of emotions that demand response. And so the feed becomes a stream of triggers, becomes designed to provoke, to upset, to capture attention through the primitive circuits that evolved to detect threat. And these circuits are not designed for the modern world, are designed for a world where threats were physical, immediate, escapable, not abstract, permanent, global, and the mismatch creates chronic activation, creates a state of perpetual vigilance that wears down the nervous system, that depletes resources, that makes rest impossible because the threats never stop, the feed never ends, the notifications never cease, and the only way to stop them is to disconnect, to turn off, to reclaim attention. But disconnection feels dangerous, feels like missing something, feels like falling behind, and falling behind is unacceptable in a culture that valorizes productivity, that measures worth in output, that treats every moment as resource to be optimized. And optimization means elimination of waste. And waste includes rest, includes boredom, includes the empty time that used to be when consciousness could wander, could explore, could discover itself. And this discovery is what is being prevented, is what the colonization of attention makes impossible. Because to know oneself requires attention turned inward, requires time that is not filled, requires boredom. And boredom is not absence, but presence, is the mind meeting itself without distraction, without mediation, without escape. And this meeting is where insight comes from, where creativity comes from, where meaning comes from. But the platforms cannot monetize insight, cannot sell creativity, cannot profit from meaning. And so these are sacrificed, are traded for engagement, for the illusion of productivity, for the feeling of being busy that is actually being used, being exploited, being colonized, and the colonization is complete when it becomes invisible, when it feels like nature, when the user cannot imagine life without the platform, cannot remember what attention felt like before it was captured, cannot conceive of consciousness that is not mediated, not monetized, not owned by someone else. And ownership is what has been achieved, is what the attention economy has accomplished, not through force but through design, through the slow accumulation of habits that become dependencies, through the gradual adjustment of expectations until constant connectivity feels normal and solitude feels strange. And strange is threatening, is to be avoided, is what the platform protects against, promises to eliminate, and the elimination is achieved, is total, is the end of privacy, the end of interiority, the end of the self that is not performing, not producing, not consuming. And what remains is the user, the node in the network, the data point in the model, the attention that is harvested and sold and never returned. And the question is whether this is sustainable, whether consciousness can survive colonization, whether attention can be extracted indefinitely without something breaking, and the breaking is already happening, is visible in the rising rates of mental illness, in the inability to be alone, in the desperation for distraction that feels like drowning, like suffocation, like something essential has been taken and cannot be recovered. And recovery would require resistance, would require the deliberate cultivation of boredom, the intentional creation of empty time, the radical act of doing nothing in a world that demands constant doing. And doing nothing is not laziness but rebellion, is the refusal to participate, is the reclamation of sovereignty, is the assertion that attention is not for sale, that consciousness is not a resource, that the self has value independent of productivity, independent of engagement, independent of what can be extracted. And this assertion is difficult, is countercultural, is fighting against systems that are designed to prevent it. But it is possible, is necessary, is the only way to escape the colonization, to restore attention to its proper owner, to make consciousness sovereign again. And sovereignty is not isolation, but autonomy, is the right to choose, the right to refuse, the right to be bored, to be slow, to be present. And presence is what the attention economy destroys, is what cannot be monetized, is what makes life worth living. And without it, all the engagement in the world is empty, is meaningless, is just motion, just noise, just the sound of attention being sold. Some ideas are not just dangerous to power, but are dangerous to existence, are not just threatening social order, but are threatening ontological stability, are not just challenging beliefs, but are challenging the structure of being itself, are ideas that when fully grasped, when completely understood, when thoroughly integrated into consciousness, produce not conversion or enlightenment, but erasure, produce the literal disappearance of those who think them, who follow them to their conclusion, who allow the ideas to transform consciousness in ways that eliminate the thinker, that dissolve the boundary between thought and reality in ways that make continued existence impossible. And the impossible is what happened, is what the records show before they were destroyed, before the archives were sealed, before the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being, threatened the continued presence of those who understood it, who saw what it revealed, who followed the logic to its endpoint and found that the endpoint was absence, was vanishing, was the ceasing to be that is not death but is something else, is something that leaves no body, no trace, no evidence except the gap where the person was, the empty space where consciousness used to organize reality. And the reality is what these ideas touch, is what they undermine, is what they show to be contingent on consciousness in ways that, when understood, completely cause consciousness to withdraw its support, to stop maintaining the structure, to allow the collapse that is not into death but into non-being, into the state that is not a state, that is not anything because it is the absence of the conditions that make anything possible. And the possible is what these ideas eliminate, is what they show to be dependent on not thinking them, on not understanding them, on maintaining the illusion that being is independent of belief, that existence is objective, that reality persists regardless of consciousness. And the regardless is what the dangerous philosophy denies, is what it shows to be false, is what it demonstrates through argument so compelling, through reasoning so rigorous, through insight so penetrating that those who follow it fully cease to provide the support that their own existence requires, cease to maintain the belief that sustains them, cease to participate in the collective agreement that makes reality real. And the real is what they stop being, is what they withdraw from, is what they are erased from, not by dying but by understanding, not by external force but by internal recognition, not by anything happening to them, but by their ceasing to happen, by their withdrawing the participation that made them exist. And the existing is what stops, is what ends, is what results in disappearance. That is literal, that is complete, that is leaving no body. Because there was never a body in the sense that is usually meant. There was only consciousness organizing sensations into the pattern called body, organizing perceptions into the pattern called world. And when that organizing stops, when that consciousness withdraws, when that participation ends, there is no body to leave behind, no corpse to bury, no physical trace, only the gap, the absence, the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the evidence shows, is what the witnesses describe before they too understand, before they too follow the reasoning, before they too are erased by the philosophy that is too dangerous to think, too powerful to contain, too true to refute. And the refutation is what is needed, is what authorities attempted, is what scholars tried to provide. But the refutation requires understanding the argument, requires following the reasoning, requires thinking the thoughts, and the thinking is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous, not to society, but to being. And being is what is at stake, is what the philosophy threatens, is what those who understand it cease to maintain. And the cessation is immediate, is total, is leaving no trace except the memory in others who did not fully understand, who stopped short of complete comprehension, who pulled back from the final step. And the step is what the censored chapter describes, is what was removed from every ethics textbook, is what was found to produce not moral transformation, but ontological dissolution, not changed behaviour, but disappeared persons. And the persons who disappeared were not killed, were not removed by force, were not eliminated by authorities, but simply ceased to be there, ceased to occupy space, ceased to organise reality, ceased to participate in existence. And the existence is. What requires participation is what depends on consciousness, maintaining belief, maintaining engagement, maintaining the structures that make being possible. And when those structures are withdrawn, when that maintenance stops, when that participation ends, there is no being, there is no presence, there is only absence, and the absence is what remains when someone thinks the dangerous thought, understands the forbidden idea, follows the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is not death but is erasure, is not ending but is never having been, is the withdrawal from existence that leaves no evidence except the gap, the space, the absence where someone was, and the was becomes uncertain, becomes questionable. Because if someone ceases to exist completely, ceases to have existed at all, then the memories of them become suspect, become unreliable, become the only trace of something that might not have happened. And the happening is what becomes uncertain, is what the philosophy undermines, is what it shows to depend on belief, on agreement, on the collective maintenance of narrative. And when one consciousness withdraws, when one participant stops maintaining, the others feel the gap. Notice the absence. Remember something that is no longer supported by reality. And the reality is what adjusts, is what fills in the gap, is what eliminates the traces, is what makes it as if the person never was. And the never was is the final stage. Is what happens after the initial disappearance, is the completion of the erasure, is the adjustment of reality to the absence, is the closing of the gap, is the collective forgetting that is not intentional but is structural, is the result of reality being maintained by agreement, by consensus, by the collective participation of consciousness. And when one consciousness withdraws, the structure adjusts, the pattern reforms, the absence is absorbed, and what remains is less than memory, is less than trace, is the vague sense that something is missing, something is wrong, something has changed, but the what is inaccessible is already fading, is already being absorbed into the adjustment, and the adjustment is complete, is total, is making it as if the disappeared never existed, never participated, never contributed to the maintenance of reality. And the reality is what continues, is what persists, is what remains. After the erasure, but the remains is less, is diminished, is showing the gap to those who know to look, who understand what has been lost, who remember what the adjustment is erasing, and the erasure is ongoing, is continuous, is the fate of those who think the dangerous thought, who understand the forbidden philosophy, who follow the reasoning to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is the ceasing to be that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the stopping of participation, is the ending of the maintenance that made existence possible. And the possible is what these people are no longer, is what they cease to be, is what they withdraw from by understanding too much, by seeing too clearly, by recognizing the contingency that makes being dependent on not seeing, on not understanding, on maintaining the illusion that existence is objective, that reality is independent, that being is not requiring constant support. And the support is what consciousness provides, is what participation maintains, is what the collective agreement enforces. And when one withdraws, when one sees through, when one understands the philosophy that makes people disappear, the withdrawal is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of understanding, and the understanding cannot be undone, cannot be forgotten, cannot be suppressed once achieved. And the achieving is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous. And the dangerous is why it was banned, why it was censored, why the chapter was removed, why the philosophers vanished, why the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being. Not because it challenged authority, but because it challenged existence. Not because it was false, but because it was too true. Was revealing what must remain hidden. Was exposing the dependence that must be denied. Was showing the contingency that must be suppressed. And the suppression is what authorities attempted, is what the banning achieved, is what the censorship maintained. But the knowledge persists, is waiting, is available to those who seek it, who find the fragments, who reconstruct the argument, who follow the reasoning, and the following is what produces the disappearance, is what causes the erasure, is what makes those who understand vanish, not into death but into absence, not into somewhere else but into nowhere, not into another state but into the cessation of states, into the withdrawal from being that is not non-being but is the ending of the distinction, is the collapse of the boundary, is the recognition that being requires participation and that participation can be withdrawn. And the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy produces, is what those who understand fully cannot avoid, because the understanding is transformation, is alteration of consciousness in ways that make continued participation impossible, that make maintenance of existence unavoidable, that make the withdrawal automatic. And the automatic is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it spread, is what makes it necessary to suppress, because those who partially understand become dangerous to others, become carriers of fragments that, if combined, could produce the full understanding, could cause more disappearances, could threaten the collective maintenance that makes reality real. And the real is what depends on not understanding, on not thinking certain thoughts, on not following certain arguments, on stopping short of certain conclusions. And the conclusions are what the censored chapter reached, is what the disappeared philosophers understood, is what the dangerous philosophy contains, is what makes thinking it produce erasure, produce disappearance, produce the vanishing that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the ceasing to participate, is the ending of maintenance, is the stopping of the support that consciousness provides. To being, and being is what ends, is what those who think the dangerous thought cease to maintain, cease to be part of, cease to exist within. And the within is what they withdraw from, is what they cease to support, is what they allow to collapse for themselves. And the collapsing is their disappearance, is their erasure, is their vanishing. And the vanishing is complete, is total, is leaving no trace, no body, no evidence, only the gap, only the absence, only the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the dangerous philosophy produces, is what thinking it creates, is what understanding it causes. And the causing is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of comprehension, and comprehension is what produces disappearance, produces erasure, produces the vanishing that is not death but is ontological suicide, is the withdrawal from existence through understanding, is the ceasing to be through recognition, is the disappearance that happens when consciousness understands that being depends on not understanding, that existence requires ignorance, that reality is maintained through participation that can be withdrawn, and the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it banned, is what makes people disappear, and disappearing is what those who think it do, is what those who understand it become, is what those who follow it to its conclusion achieve, which is not enlightenment but is erasure, is not transcendence but is vanishing, is not liberation but is disappearance, is the ceasing to be, that is literal, that is complete, that is the result of understanding the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappearing is what it does, is what it causes, is what makes it the most dangerous idea, the most forbidden knowledge, the philosophy that breaks reality, that causes ontological suicide, that produces erasure through understanding. And understanding is what causes disappearance, is what makes people vanish, is what the banned philosophy does, and doing is what it continues to do, is what it will always do. To those who think it, who understand it, who follow it to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending of being through understanding, is ontological suicide through philosophy, is the dangerous thought that makes people disappear. And disappearing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappear they did, and disappear they will. Those who think it, those who understand it, those who follow the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is absence, is vanishing, is erasure, is disappearance. And disappearance is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is the philosophy that makes people disappear. And disappear is what they do, is what understanding causes, is what the dangerous thought produces, is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending through. Understanding is the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear.